Hello, friends. Welcome to the Main Idea Book Club, where today we are having a conversation about this past month's book, Robert Kennedy, His Life by Eric Thomas. To stay up to date with the book club, which book we will be reading next, and other ways to get involved, please subscribe to the mailing list in the show notes or visit www.mainideapodcast.com. This April, although we're a little bit behind schedule due to the size of the previous book and the fact that I'm a really slow reader, we will be reading Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu. Today, I am joined with my friend Eric Ruiz. Eric is the head of business development for Google One in the Americas, covering the US and Latin America, co-founder of Eric's Nopales, a family-owned pickled cactus company, and author of Blackout Wednesday, which is now available on Amazon. If you enjoy these episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple, or better yet, share it with a friend. Without further ado, the Main Idea Book Club, Season 1, Episode 4. All right, Eric, book number 4, a big boy, Robert Kennedy. I would not have probably reached for this, so I'm really glad that it was suggested. I wanted to read like a political biography for a long time, and this one turned out to be fantastic for plenty of reasons that I'm sure we'll discuss in here. I'm curious, though, because I know that you liked this book, and I know I did too. Do you have any criticisms of this book? Was there anything that you couldn't subscribe to or you found difficult to read through?
It's a great question. I thought the scholarship was excellent, and I don't think I'm well versed enough in that academic research to strongly push back on anything specifically. I think if I had one criticism, it would be I kind of wanted just a little bit more, just like entertain me just a little bit more with some of the theories. And I understand, for example, why Evan Thomas couldn't do it. But for example, like give me more, what could have happened to JFK or what could have happened, to RFK and the missiles with Turkey. Like maybe perhaps just a little bit more of like entertaining the sinister side, I think would have been just really interesting, just as someone, and perhaps you fall into this category too, but like some of the first conspiracy theories I ever heard growing up were like, the government, the mob, aliens killed JFK and RFK. So perhaps it's that. And like I said, I don't have any real strong feelings on the research, mostly because I'm just not very well versed in to push back on some of those points. So maybe that's my only criticism. Be a bit more cynical.
Yeah, I felt like there's so much. It almost takes a scholar to be able to sift through this kind of stuff because it is so well researched. I mean, down to even quotes that he's pulling from small conversations that were had in behind closed doors. Like it reads straight through, but you consider how much information he's actually reducing down to put words on the page. It's pretty impressive, and there's so much information, and it's not the biggest time. Like after they get past the early family stuff and the dynamics of the brotherhood and the dynamics of RFK and JFK and their father and everything, and you kind of get into the thick of the campaigning and his role alongside his brother. It's not the longest time frame, yet it reads like it's like much bigger than that. It's kind of impressive.
Yeah.
I kind of wish that I had read more books prior to this one in a way. Like I wish I had read more about LBJ. I wish I had read more about Hoover. I wish I had separately just dedicated some time to read about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the politics and just the temperature of the country at that point, because I had to take everything in this as historical context and also the story about RFK. So I feel like going into this book with a thorough understanding of the 60s and just politics in general, and maybe even more nuance to each one of the characters would set you up a little bit better, because I know that you've had the chance and have taken that chance to actually do that. So you came into it with a little bit better understanding of that whole time period. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of my favorite, I think perhaps my favorite biography series is the one that Robert Carroll did on LBJ. It's
Mhm.
incredible. You can probably see him back here somewhere, I think.
In
So
the
I had a
collection.
real, yeah, in the collection. So I had a really good, and actually I referenced a couple of the volumes, especially around JFK's campaign. I would pull the books, that Carol wrote and like cross-reference just to like
Mhm.
give additional context and like paint like a more like a broader picture. And so I thought that was really, really helpful. And I think one thing listeners will realize as they continue sort of reading is that like one book unlocks like five other books. And so
Yeah.
once you kind of read one in like the starter pack, let's call it, reading the next one becomes a little bit easier. And then reading the one after that becomes a little bit easier because you can already start to fill the gaps with like previous previous context. And you're right, man. Like the other surprising thing about this was how so much happened in like the 3 years that like JFK was president. Because part of the focus of this book is how Robert is his brother's keeper, and
Right.
it's how many pages is this? 390 something?
394.
Yeah, 394. And the bulk of it just happens within that, within those 3 or 4 years. Um, so I thought that to me was really interesting. Is there anything about Bobby, I know he hated being called that, that really surprised you? Or was there anything in the book in general that you were like, "Oh, I had a very different understanding of that before," or "Wow, I did not know this was a thing."
So, to be embarrassingly transparent with you, reading through this, I had forgotten entirely that he was even assassinated. So I didn't even realize that JFK and RFK were assassinated. Like, I obviously learned that in like AP history and stuff in high school, but for whatever reason it escaped me. And when I read this, that surprised me again, embarrassingly. But there was something about his character that I think he explained it really well towards the end of the book when he's talking about the assassination in the last, final pages, and you're getting an understanding like who really was this guy. And
Yeah.
I appeal a lot to the humanism of him as a flawed character who lacked, I think, the confidence that perhaps like his brother had or his dad had it instilled on his brother and really kept from him.
Mhm.
That in the back of his mind there was always doubt and uncertainty. And
Yeah.
when they were describing in the end, he was reflecting on JFK as really like the politician, and then he was reflecting on RFK as more of this emotional guy who might, didn't always know if he was right, but he was trying to figure it out. And I kind of appreciate that. I think a book about politics, it's hard to get like the personal story, and that was something that kept coming back to me a lot in this book is
Yeah.
that you see, uh it's like you don't want to meet your idols, they always say. And this book does a lot of that is you see behind the veil that this is just it's a family. It's a family of people. They have sibling rivalries and dynamics just like
Yeah.
anybody else. They obviously come from this very privileged background, so it's much different. But here's this guy who's, although flawed, doing his best to try to understand those that are being put down, or maybe those that are suffering from poverty or inequality, and at a time when that was definitely not the norm. I mean, you look at the civil rights movement in the 60s and how front and center that was to America. For him to have his perspectives was nuance. That was different, right? He actually, even though he may still have had some flaws within that and not seen things equitably that we would think about, today,
Mhm.
he was trying to do that to the best of his abilities, and he was kind of breaking the mold on how you go about that. So I kept turning back to that. It was an interesting book of an unsung hero in a way, who, like you said, was his brother's keeper, but was also this human being trying to figure things out as he went through. What about you?
Yeah. Yeah, there was this line in the book where he talks about how towards the end of his life, Robert became more of the moral crusader that everyone thought JFK was, which I
Hmm.
thought was really interesting. And I think the other surprising thing about Bob's character is just how he was full of contradictions. Like if we look at the civil rights issue in Oxford, Mississippi, and they're trying to enroll James Meredith, they're trying to get the mob to stand down, and he thought it was the right thing to do for James to enroll, but he also had to be mindful of like the real politique,
Hmm.
I suppose, and do it in a way that doesn't cause like another civil war, I think was one of the words that was used in the book. And so the kind of like the backroom deals that he did with like Ross Barnett, whom I believe was the governor of Alabama of Mississippi at the
Hmm.
time, that was really interesting. I thought a lot of the back channel stuff that he did and during the Cuban Missile Crisis with his Russian cutout was really interesting, especially since sometimes he would keep information from his brother, the president. The other thing that was kind of like surprising as well, and maybe it's like was his dark humor. There was so many
Yeah.
instances of just like, like he asked one of his assistants, like right after his JFK's funeral, "Hey, been any good funerals lately?" Just like
Yeah.
it was very just sort of painful, but also like kind of a testament to um how he dealt with grief. And to kind of go back to the contradiction part, he that's for several times in the book, Evan Thomas said that RFK was somebody that liked liked solving people's problems or cared about people's problems, but didn't necessarily like individual people. So like if you
Mhm.
were a friend of his and you came to him complaining about something, he kind of be like, well, toughen up, right?
Right.
And that was such sort of an interesting criticism, but also just like a reality of how the, not maybe not just flawed he was, but also just how when you're dealing at that level of power, I guess it's probably not scalable to solve everyone's issues one on one, and you have to
Right.
take a more, like a different approach. But it was also, I think I remember someone saying that like someone calling him like a limousine liberal, where it's like, you care, it's like you pay lip service, but, like, do you actually care? And had
Right.
I not known the work that RFK did later in his life with, like, Cesar Chavez and,
Mhm.
even some of the, campaigning in the inner cities, he could have been just someone that was saying all this as lip service, but he seemed, at least by the end of his life, to, like, generally care about the plight. And I think it was actually the meeting he had with Cesar Chavez where he was like, "I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna run for president."
Right.
And I thought that was, like, a really cool, sort of evolution of his character.
Yeah, I found this quote that kind of sums up like the difference between him and his brother, but this was a quote from John Bartlow Martin, and he says, "Jack Kennedy was more the politician, saying things publicly that he privately scoffed at. Robert Kennedy was more himself. Jack gave the impression of decisive leadership, the man with all the answers. Robert seemed more hesitant, less sure he was right, more tentative, more questioning, and completely honest about it. Leadership he showed, but it had a different quality, an off-trail, unorthodox quality. To some extent, a quality of searching for answers to hard questions in company with his
Mm,
bewildered audience, trying to work things out with their help." And I think that like it's unfair because it's chosen at the end of the book to sum up his character, but I think it very beautifully does because there are there's so I think this more than anything it painted an interesting picture of the complexity of what politics actually are and what they're trying to accomplish. I mean, at the
yeah.
same time that you're trying to juggle whether or not you send more troops to war, you're also fighting labor unions and your brother's getting assassinated, and there's all these complex issues going on, and it's kind of unrealistic for us to think that one person is up there solving it. And we know that they're not, right? There's a lot of people involved in these decisions. What do you think about like the assassination attempts uh, on Fidel Castro, the wiretapping of Martin Luther King Jr., some of these like you know, less glorified things that he was very much a part of, that can definitely fall into the bucket of just the complexities of politics, but also, a product of the times. You look at the tension around the Cuban Missile Crisis, the whole fear of Soviet Russia and spies. What are your take on those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough to say because we don't have the context that they had at the time. And the MLK stuff as well. I think, by the way, I think it was just like the 56th anniversary of his assassination a couple of days ago. Um, Man, that was a rough decade, dude. MLK with JFK, MLK, RFK, Malcolm
Mm.
X. That was rough. And so on the one hand, we don't have the same context that they did back then, but also like it kind of goes back to like the pragmatism that I feel that RFK had to exhibit at times. And there was sort of another quote, the one you shared reminded me of one that Arthur Schlesinger, totally butchering his last name, wrote. He
That
said,
works.
In comparing the brothers, he said that JFK was a realist brilliantly disguised as a romantic, whereas the younger, a romantic stubbornly disguised as a realist.
Hmm.
And I think some of those things, the Red Scare. I mean, RFK was on the committee with Senator McCarthy. I think they're just sort of lingering effects of the time, and I think it's easy for us to look back and sort of condemn some of that behavior or some of those actions, but we can only do with like the benefit of hindsight, right?
Right.
Um, I think what was really some of my personal takeaways on this were the way RFK kind of navigated towards the middle during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the meetings of I think it was called XCOM. You had the
Yep.
Hawks, you had the Doves, and he was sort of brilliantly able to, switch sides when he needed to stir up debate. He was able to ask like the tough questions. He was able to like play the tape forward and see what would happen. Like, okay, well, if we do this, then the Soviets will take Berlin, and then what? And then what? And so it's kind of this exhibition of like decision making and judgment under pressure, which is like sort of like the best way to judge or assess like a person's career, right? And like by all like,
Yeah.
intents and purposes, like he excelled in this. Like he performed admirably and kept us from the brink of World War III. And so let me ask you something then: is
Yeah.
the if we look at the Oxford crisis with James Meredith, shortly after that, RFK says something to the effect of, this will help me, or I think was the author, like, you know, this will help me prepare for like future misfortune or for like worse events to come, which is kind of pressing considering that shortly after that came the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so you
Right.
have to wonder how much of the decision making, the mistakes, the failures of the Ole Miss situation affected RFK's decision making in during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I guess the question I have for you is, what experiences that were terrible at the time, or you can call them misfortune, helped you prepare for even uh, for more challenging setbacks in the future?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Um, I mean, I think the obvious one that always comes to mind for me was being confronted with uh, alcoholism in the family. You're
Yeah.
talking about a personal experience, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
for
yeah,
sure.
right, yeah, for sure, yeah.
uh, Being confronted with that at a young age and having to, in
Deal with
if
that,
memory
yeah.
serves me, kind of like rise up to deal with that at assume a more mature age than I was to confront it, which is
Hmm.
uh, to keep this brief and not trail off into a whole family story there. Um, I think having to do that at a younger age was really hard, uh, but it taught me to face things that are difficult head on, like actually literally head on, and it also taught me to reflect on things to gain out of them lessons for the future, but not dwell on them to where they start to suck you down. And that
Yeah.
wasn't a choice. Like, I wouldn't go back necessarily and make that same choice to have to deal with that. And I don't think that my father would either. But we're at a place now where we're absolute best friends on a much deeper level than we probably ever would have been had we not gone through something so chaotic together. So that's a very stark example of like past experience that was borderline traumatic or difficult serving to improve something in the future, and then also teach me on a personal level how to kind of look at complex situations like that are emotionally charged and not silence that but compress it a little bit so that I can use the rest of my senses to make decisions around that. So that's kind of what
Mm,
comes to mind first. I also think to note just on the book, like, that time, the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think I text you like, we got to read a book just separately about the
yeah.
dynamics of this. Like, it seems like such a dice roll that didn't go wrong. And maybe that's a heightened perspective because I also simultaneously listened to this like 2-hour episode about the threats of nuclear war and the different kind of procedures in place if that were to take off. So it was very front and center at the same time that I was reading this part of the book. And I do think like his past experience might have served him in that instance, but at the same time, that was a once in history instance where it's truly at the brink. I mean, when you read through those pages and they are at the brink, it's like, are we going to press the button or not? It really seemed like that might happen. And this is, 45 plus years removed reading this as a 35-year-old. I couldn't imagine what it was like being in the public, the tension and the fear on a daily basis of what was happening. Um, that just seemed like it was like this close to really going down. And so I don't know how much of that is uh, quality decision making based on past experience and how much of that was like just luck of the draw that neither side ended up putting the launch codes in. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There was definitely an element of luck, and there's a feeling that Khrushchev pulled back because he got scared of, or maybe he just woke up feeling better on on whatever that day was. But I think it's hard to dismiss that these guys played out the tape. And I think a lot of it was due to to RFK kind of being the guy that was like, look, if we start bombing them now, that's like the absolute worst thing we can do. That is going to
Right.
set off a chain reaction. So we can't do that. So you had to fight off everyone internally who wanted to do that. Then the second thing that they couldn't do was just not do nothing, because now they're looking bad. They're acquiescing to Soviet demands, and it's just not going to be good for their alliances
Right.
and our relationships abroad. The so there's also, I think, even playing armchair diplomat here, I think those guys did sort of everything that they could control. I think they did it well. I just think that there's still that element of luck, but I think in this specific scenario, there was enough good judgment that withstood pressure from all angles to like get the best possible outcome. And even like the Turkey missiles, that was like a nice little foresight and negotiation where they were like, look, we're not going to put this down in writing. I know this is important to you. Once things settle down, we will get this to you.
That was
And the other thing,
like a slickness that I think was definitely a skill of his that they did show developing in the earlier pages of the book, to have that like foresight to know that the best way to offer that part of the deal was to offer it in the context with which they offered it, which is basically the context that they could renege if they wanted to and not follow through on that part of the agreement. That was very crafty. I fully support that.
and another interesting thing that I learned about myself on this is, the author says that Alke had the ability to switch sides when necessary or to like push back for the sake of pushing back. And I don't know if it's because I'm a contrarian and if that's because I'm a little bit narcissistic, but throughout my life, I grew up in Northern California to Mexican parents. I was the first of my family to go to college. I was the first, I worked in tech, which was, there wasn't other people like me. And by that, I mean like other kids from like working class,
Yeah.
lower socioeconomic status families. So I've always sort of felt like a fish out of water. And I think that has helped me throughout the years. And again, I don't know if this is to my benefit or to my detriment, but it has helped me throughout the years sort of easily see the other side of things and be the guy that sometimes needs to like, wait, we all agree about this? Like, well, hold on, something's not right. Like, I'm going to be the guy that's like, I'm going to become the devil's advocate on this. And I remember like being in a meeting at work where my boss was like, guys, if all of us agree right now to as this a next step, it's either we're not thinking about this clearly or there's some stuff we haven't thought about. Like
Right.
we haven't assessed all the blind spots. So I'm curious if that resonated with you at all.
Yeah, I there were parts of his character that I really admire. There were parts that I respect. And then there were parts where I was having a hard time deciding if they are traits of a politician that are unavoidable. Like if one is to find themselves in
Mm-hmm.
politics and you're committed to it in the capacity that he was, right? He's a senator who's really playing second fiddle in the presidential role. I mean, I think JFK is a much different president without RFK. So I that role
Yeah.
seems very powerful. Like they were JFK for sure was the president, obviously, but RFK played a huge role and he provided a level of scrutiny and a level of honesty and a level and listening that other people can't provide because they weren't his brother. That is an extremely special dynamic, and I think that it was
You
hard
can't
for
fire your
me.
brother.
Yeah, it was hard for me to discern through certain things. Like, I almost look at like when he's going toe to toe with Jimmy Hoffa. You can look at Jimmy and say Jimmy's a criminal, right? But to Jimmy's people, he's a hero, right? Like the union workers stuff love the guy. So if you look at it from their perspective, they are bolstering this guy up, and they love him. But you can look at him as a mafia extension. You can look at him as a criminal, an embezzler, all these kind of things, and then look at RFK as the hero. But if you look at their tit for tat, they're demonstrating the same characteristics towards each other, absent of their political responsibility. And so those were the parts where I'm like, I don't know if I can fully support like him being him against this guy just because from the author's point of view, from the public's point of view, this person's bad. And you could agree that they were quote bad because of their criminal behavior, but even some of that seemed like subjective at the same time that like the government's kind of in with the mob when it's convenient, but then they're trying to put the mob behind bars when it's publicly disadvantageous. And I don't love that part of the character, but I don't know if that's because he's just a politician and that's the board game that's in front of you, or if that's because his character was flawed in that regard.
Yeah, Bob was definitely way more black and white, no pun intended, about like issues.
Yeah,
This is bad or this is evil and this is good and we're on the side of good. Like, he wasn't able to see like a gray area at times or like sort of compromise until maybe much later or maybe in hindsight, right? Like,
right.
he kind of had a knack for like people that weren't useful to him to just kind of like be demeaning or like just like set them aside. And there was once where I forgot where around during the Cuban Missile Crisis where JFK asks for a former Secretary of Defense to come give his point of view on things, and Bobby was just kind of like, "Hey, you get in here now," and JFK was like, "Bro, what the heck, dude? Like, show some respect," or something to that effect. So I thought that was sort of the nastier side of RFK.
So this what you just touched on is something that I actually did love about this book. I loved that I would reflect on this book as a praise of the character and the mystery of who our RFK was, right? You could say that this is about someone who we can look at it as who had great American hero potential, who was a do right by the people, roll his sleeves up and work and like participate with those in need. But he had this hard side where he could make tough decisions, right? It's kind of like a characteristic that you want in a politician is the human side, but you want him to be able to, if you get coordinates for like a Taliban general in a hut, you don't want someone who's timid in pressing the button to authorize the drone strike. You want someone who's comfortable making tough decisions and being, I think, authoritative in instances. That's something that you have to be when you sign up for that type of job. So I think in reflection, it's like a praise of who he was, but the author did a good job of showing these other sides that these people in these positions still suffer from human conundrums that we all do. You still deal with the range of human emotions. And it's on a heightened scale because you're a politician in the face of the whole country and let alone the world, right? So that's a lot of pressure to operate under. And I just felt like it did a really good job of showing you these two sides. It's whereas I think I've read some biographies in the past that maybe aren't as objective. So you get kind of a spun version of undying support and praise of somebody, whereas this left you with some uncertainty or it gave you the opportunity to be doubtful of how you feel about him or curious, which I think that's how RFK felt.
You touched on something interesting that I want to expand on. So I think it was during JFK's Senate campaign in 56. From the outside looking in, it looked like the perfect campaign. Handsome president, television, he's doing all the right things. But then within the campaign, because Joe Kennedy was basically like, "Hey Robert, like you're gonna help your brother," but within the campaign, it was so disorganized, like nobody knew what they were doing, and I think that's really fascinating because I think a lot of times we have this idea that in order to start or to do anything, it has to be perfect. I have to have the right laptop to write a book. I have to have the right software. I have to have the right leaders. I have to, sorry, the right mentors, the right everything. And you kind of, and then when your mind state is like that, you just never do anything. Whereas when you read examples of like the inside scoop on how these momentous decisions or these momentous things were done, you realize everybody was just kind of figuring it out as they went along, and it was a freaking mess. And so I really appreciated that aspect of it, of just like even these folks from like a prestigious family and from one of the richest families in America, like still kind of had to go through the same growing pains that the rest of us have to, of like figuring things out. That campaign comes to mind, or even like the back and forth during the 1960 campaign when
Mhm.
like they offered LBJ the vice presidency, but only because they thought he would reject it. But then he
Right.
accepted it, and they were kind of like, "Oh shit, well, what do we do now?" So all of that was just calling like, dude, it's like politicians, man, you're just like us.
The one thing I was it's a silly thing to be, like, disappointed about, but I wish that he was a little more confident in his willingness to speak on the Vietnam War, because it was very clearly it was a public sticking point against LBJ, right? People wanted out of the war, kinda towards the end of this book when they're starting to really press this issue. People wanted out of the war. Thousands of American soldiers are dying. It's oppressing largely the group of people that RFK is concerned with, which are impoverished people, right? The wealthy and affluent people during the draft period were averting the draft through circumstances that only they could achieve, right? Utilizing their resources to get out of it. So it falls largely on the impoverished to go. So it's speaking to the group of people that RFK is out to defend most. It's an opportunity to stand up and kind of go head to head with LBJ, which is what they're doing behind closed doors anyway. I just wish that he had a little like either I wish that he had more confidence to stand up on that earlier, not when it was convenient, because that is how he felt, or I wish that I better understood the dynamics beyond what the book gave us to see maybe why he didn't. What did you think about that part of it, like
Yeah,
his stance on Vietnam in that time? Because here he is hanging out with like Allen Ginsberg and all, the the alt culture, and then he's also not standing up against his biggest enemy.
I think I think that goes back to Bobby's like the like an internal fight that he had, because on the one hand he was this moralist, but on the other he was a pragmatist. And
Mhm,
so the there was this documentary on Netflix that I watched in the run up to this book club meeting, which is Bobby Kennedy for President, and they
mhm,
talk a little bit about this, where they basically said, like, look, like he didn't want to throw his hat in the ring for the nomination in '68 because it would throw the party into disarray. To throw his name so
mhm,
late into the like once Johnson announced that he wasn't running, that he wouldn't seek another term. For RFK to do that, it would just throw everything into chaos. Like they were the incumbent party fighting a very unpopular war, so the likelihood of them losing was already pretty high. And to do that, to add that extra wrinkle in of like now RFK's hat in the ring, it would just basically spell doom, I think, and like kill their chances to win in the '68 election, which they ultimately did lose, right? Like Nixon won in
right, right.
'68. So I think it kind of came back to the two opposing forces within Bobby Kennedy, the moralist, but also the pragmatist. And it wasn't until I think he met with Cesar Chavez that where he was kind of like, all right, I have to do this. I have to
Right.
run.
He was
But by then it was
inspired.
already, yeah, but by then it was already too late. I mean, or too late in the sense that he didn't have the support. He had to go do a lot of primaries. I think he did Oregon and California like in the same day, which is quite the achievement, but also like kind of shows how hurried this all was towards the end. And I know we're almost at time, but there's one thing that I
Yeah.
wanted to that I wanted to ask. Um, we're in an election year,
Mhm.
so a lot of stuff is going on. Um, you and I met when we were in our early 30s doing jujitsu.
Yep.
we've grown quite a bit since then. So is there any issue or any points of view that you've changed your mind over in the past couple of years? And that could be political, or it could be personal, or it could be, any combination thereof. Because you watched RFK go from this like communist hunter to kind of like changing his stance against Joe McCarthy, and you
Yeah.
see changing points of view throughout the story of this book. So I'm curious if you've gone through any such changes in points of view.
I think so. This is, I don't know. This doesn't necessarily have to do with politics, but one thing I have definitely gone through as an individual, and I think it leans heavily into my career, but also how I view the world, is I have become way less dogmatic in my views about anything, whether that's a view on fitness and the best way to X, Y, or Z, or recommendations around programming, up to politics and stance and views. I just don't feel overly convicted, black and white, about anything. And I feel much more interested in understanding views that I internally feel inclined to be dogmatic about. And I think that's partially a big part of why I enjoyed doing the podcast. Is I'm often met with views that aren't like mine. And if you aren't interested in learning or listening to the people that you're hearing from, it's a horrible line of work and creativity to be in. So that is something where I think in the past I would hardline uh, items a lot, whether it was political, personal, spiritual, nutritional, training. And I just have a much more open
Carnivore
view,
diet
I
only.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah, a much more open view, and I really reject dogmatic views now. Maybe that's a flaw in and of itself, but if I come across things where someone is saying you have to do the carnivore diet is the only way to XYZ, or if you vote conservative, then you're like this, or if you're a liberal, then you're like that. Those kind of views, I don't enjoy hearing those perspectives, because to me it sounds like someone who hasn't spent time interested in enough in understanding what else is out there. And I think that characteristic, a willingness to learn and an openness to hear other people, is a very attractive quality in people that I appreciate a lot at this point in my life. What
Nice,
about
man.
you? You got 3 minutes to
That's a
answer,
powerful
Eric.
note.
And I want to hit us with a
Three
quote at the end
minutes.
before you got to jump in your video.
Yeah. So I think the biggest change for me has been, I'm a husband now, I'm a father, so I'm spending a lot of time thinking about raising families and how to best
Mhm,
support families and children. And maybe it's a combination of not having to have thought about this, years before. Um, I'm sure that has something to do with it, but I'm starting to really think through past assumptions and beliefs around like government support for families.
mhm.
Like namely, I think that, I wonder if more can't be done to help small children, to help the elderly in, within this country. This is not, again, not to turn it super political, but like, for example, I have a strong job, I have strong support, the resources to like, get me out of, tight situations. And even still, like raising a family is hard, right? So I
Yeah,
can't imagine like my parents, my dad made $10,000 in 1992, for example, like if they had one bad day, like it had just ramifications that went throughout the entire family. So I can't imagine how they did it back then, which gives me more of an appreciation for them and their sacrifices, but also makes me wonder about families like them today and like how
yeah,
they're getting by in a country that sometimes is hyper individualistic to a fault, and
totally.
sometimes leans in too much into the, well, this is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and
Mhm.
you know the family unit is the most important thing, but we're not going to tell you how to support it. um I guess like one idea that it came to mind that I've talked about with my wife before is like there should be like a national preschool. There should be like a
Yeah,
national, uh, you know, maybe something else for children, from 2 to 4 that can help working families not have to struggle with childcare so much. So it's sort of like ideas like that. And I
yeah.
think before I had kids, I was more so along the lines of like of like, no, don't worry. I just, not that it wasn't a big deal, but I just thought the status quo was fine. And
Yeah,
now it's apparent that I think it needs to change.
I think that's a it's a great perspective because it shows growth and awareness to your situation, but then also the ability to expand that to what other people might feel like. And I mean, this book is a lot of, he was able to do that. He was able to think about how someone who, his situation was so far beyond privileged compared to the large majority of people that he connected with. And I think that it was his ability to see things, um, like you said. I'll close us out here with um, a little quote, and then we'll end. Um, it says, Kennedy's defiance of danger was heroic, but also slightly compulsive. He seemed to be daring death as a way of coping with the dread of it. For RFK, courage was a shield, a defense against the demons of self doubt. It had been all his life, from the first dive into Nantucket Sound to the subsequent plunges down frozen slopes and into icy waters from Utah to Maine and South America. We cannot know all the fears that lurked in Kennedy's head and heart, but judging from his obsession with courage, they were many and rarely quiet. And I fucking love that quote. This was a good one. Unfortunately, borrowed time today due to technical issues. So thank you, everyone who's still listening with us, and especially those of you who read along on this super thick book. So we'll be doing this again in a month. I'm excited to see where we go on book 5. This has been really fun. And Eric, as always, I really appreciate you taking the time to read with me, but also sit down and talk because it's super fun. These conversations always go in different places beyond the book, and I think that that's a really fun theme that's emerging from our time
I
here.
love
So
it.
thank you, man.
Oh, thank you as well, dude. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your choice. I think you're up next for book 5. So we'll brainstorm, but it'll be your call.
Deal. Hey, friends, Abe here. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode and sticking around to the very end. If you want to support it, leave a 5-star review on Spotify or check out www.maynideapodcast.com. Join the mailing list and stay up to date on all things The Main Idea, from future guests, sponsorship opportunities, products that I'm using to help me perform at my best, invites to ask me anything, and any upcoming pertinent information to the show. I cannot do this show without you. It is literally why I show up each week and put these episodes together. So thank you from the bottom of my heart from being part of the community. I hope you have a great day.